We all know about Casio and Timex and their digital watch catalogue. We may even be enthusiasts that collect old models from Seiko, Texas Instruments, and other electronics companies before they threw in the towel, as well as maybe the famous Hamilton Pulsar. However, something I've noted is that people are often surprised to learn about the digital watch game of modern day, primarily Swiss-made luxury brands. Now this video digs into those examples, and I'm excited to share it with you as there's some seriously cool ones. First, we all know our Speedies, Speedmaster and perhaps a Railmaster or two, but did you know about Omega's extensive digital watch range? This begins with the Omega time computer LED models between 1972 and 74, leveraging the technology behind the more famous Hamilton Pulsar, with this iteration having 2 buttons. Where things start getting cool is with the Chrono Quartz 1611 Albatross, apparently so named because of the battery clamp system being similar to an albatross wing, with birds being a continued naming convention for many of these models, as you'll see. It was the world's first and a digi chronograph and was tied into the 1976 Montreal Olympics through Omega's sponsorship of the event. In 1976 there was the introduction of the Cobra 1615 module. I've read that it was the module that was named as such, but for me the style of the bracelet does look quite Cobra-ish, so I'm going to make that assumption. Let me know in the comments if you know why this is the case. Now this is cool. In 1977 we have the launch of the 1620 model, which is the Falcon or Falcon caliber, birds again in a few different varieties, including this Speedmaster brand, as you will see on screen. This was one of the flatter calibers of the time. As you can see from this excellent website about these Omega LCD Speedmasters, this watch was put forward as an option for the NASA Space Shuttle pilots as part of the Alaska program, with the Alaska 4 being a particular version of the Falcon watch specifically developed for this role. The nice tweak is that rather than the normal light bulb background of the traditional Falcon, this special version deployed the so-called Beta Light system, which was 2 strips of tritium. Apparently it was used in some training missions but wasn't fully adopted due to a preference for mechanical watches by NASA at the time, but it did set the groundwork for another Omega watch that we'll come back to later. Around the same time, the Chouette or Owl watch, branded as memomaster, was released. Apparently has claims as being one of the first microprocessor multi-memory calibers. Note the speaker for the alarm on the front and the ability to check your agenda. Next, and breaking with bird tradition, in 1980 we had the 1640 sensor quartz, nicknamed the Okapi, which, unless I'm missing something, I believe is some kind of field giraffe. This was properly innovative technology and I think may have been the first watch to deploy touchscreen technology within a digital watch. Another memo watch is the Martinet, which was actually made specifically for the 1981 Swiss women's Olympic skiing team, but there are sadly no pictures I can find anywhere. But there is a more broadly available ladies' watch which is called the Alouette, which, as well as being a song we all know, is a kind of lark, so still fitting with the bird theme. Also in 1981 we get to Omega's answer to the JLC Reverso in the 1655 Equinoxe. You can spin round the display to move between either an analog or digital display, and these go for a pretty penny. A last batch of Omegas with digital elements that I'll include start with the 1986 Seamaster Multifunction, apparently being described as the watch with 8 faces and a magic crown, which you'll note combines the normal analog with digital display elements. This was a precursor to the X33 series, which continued Omega's desire to get these kinds of watches into the hands of pilots and astronauts. Now the first X33 was launched in 1998, and it's been a continued series, for example this Flightmaster iteration, that runs through to today, primarily labelled as Speedmaster Professional. What Swiss brand do we have next? Well, we all love a pointer date, Diver 65 and an Aquis, but now you know that after Oris joining the organisation that would later become the Swatch Group in 1971, they were tasked with looking into LCD development for the group's watches. Now this resulted in a whole array of different random Oris digitals, which were largely calibers taken from elsewhere and assembled and cased as Orises and as other Swatch Group watches. I've pieced together some examples which are few and far between, What we do know is that they start around 1974 with the Oris 772, and then there was a whole range of largely Japanese and Korean source models before they quit the General Watch Company in 1982 and totally stopped quartz before 1991. So what about Heuer, or as it is now, Tag Heuer? Now Heuer's main angle was of course racing chronographs, and this theme carried over into their initial use of LED and LCD displays, starting with the 1972 Microsplit 800 pocket stopwatch, which would later be translated over to the LCD version with the 420. Apparently Jack Heuer believed strongly that the electronic watch would be an important driver for the future, so they came up with a whole bunch of seriously cool watches. Now I do have to shout out the Raw Saw website here, who's a restorer of these watches and has some amazing details on these models. The first is of course the Chrono Split, the world's first split LED LCD quartz digital watch. This would of course be later carried over to an LCD version. Next is the 1977 weird coffin-shaped Manhattan GMT, which if you dig around you'll find a weird instance where there's a DKNY version where they somehow managed to get the license. A more straight-ahead stopwatch on the wrist was the 1977 Microsplit 370, with other cool watches from their catalogue being the Senator GMT, the Kentucky, and models like the Carrera available in so-called Twin Time in 1978. Other oddities include the Ford Split Lap 77, which looks like something straight out of a sci-fi set, as well as other models using the 2-time and more straight-ahead digital model you see on screen. Since Tag came in, there has been a tie-in with the F1 FIA Championship, which would be the basis for the later Micro Timer, which you can still buy today, I believe, as well as their Tag Connected series of watches, with the Super Mario collaboration being something that's been a big splash recently. I'm not sure how many of you will know Sicura, but trust me, you'll be glad to have learned about them if you've not. They're very intertwined with Breiting, as they essentially acquired them and actually phased out their own brand. So this wasn't because Sicura didn't have their own cool stuff going, quite the contrary, as you'll see. This starts of course with the presentation at the Basel Fair in 1976 of the Superman, which is an early iteration of the kinetic watch, with the generator driving an LED display. The 1976 or 1977 Chrono Flash with the Frontier Module 2006 was their more straight-ahead LED module, but the cooler launch that year was the 1976 Solar Star Quartz, I believe one of the first ever solar digital watches. There's the very, very sought-after VIP 2000, how cool does that look? Which was also around this time and I believe is the grail of a few folks, including one following this channel. And they did do some more mainstream looking pieces like the Sicura Chrono Alarm. Breitling also had its own digital watch catalogue, and here's one of their more basic 70s models. A look that they would use quite a bit is a display within conventional analogue watches, which began in the 70s I believe with the Navitimer series in both LED and LCD formats. In 1986, Breitling introduced the first iteration of what would be their main style of this sort of watch, with a digital display going forwards, which was the Aerospace range. This same aesthetic was deployed in their infamous Emergency series, complete with distress beacon, with some special iterations such as their Co-Pilot with a second LCD display in the bracelet, this cool watch for the 90s, and their connected range of today such as the Exospace Yachting watch. Now that you know, I think you'll agree that Breitling have a pretty cool heritage here if you include Sicura heritage. So who's next? Longines. And guess what? They have all sorts of digitals. Of course, they had the LED models similar to Omega and Hamilton Pulsar, and working with Texas Instruments, I believe, they were one of the first to deploy the emerging LCD display, but I think it may have been the dynamic scattering type because of that milky look you can see. The design is pretty cool though, with where the numbers are placed, and I think it makes it look very modern despite being, I believe, launched at Basel Fair in 1972. I think they're one of the first users of the Swiss Pallas LCD quartz, which I believe is behind the model you see on screen, which deployed a more twisted pneumatic style LCD display. Similar to the chrono split of Heuer, in the mid-70s they launched the Gemini 1 with the LCD and LED display, which would be built upon with the Gemini 2, which I believe was a collaboration with Hughes Aircraft, and is similar in focus to the Heuer chrono split, enabling it to be read day and night, as the marketing material claimed. There are plenty more Longines models, so here are 3 remaining ones from their catalogue, which is primarily within the 70s, although this Ana Digi may have crept into the 80s. Of course, we can't not talk about Rolex. Now, these guys didn't really see digitals as being commensurate with their brand, but one project where they did at least strongly consider it was the FAN project, or Forme Analogique, with calibre 7035, which had at least 5 working prototypes in 1978. It was essentially a pseudo analog display. Very cool, but Rolex are very strict about what they'll sign off on, and it was not released due to its lack of alignment with their brand philosophy. Let's have a more abbreviated tour of some other Swiss brands and see what we have. Mondaine, you'll likely know for their famous stop clock at Swiss railway stations, but they had a whole bunch of digitals under the Digi Quartz banner with sub-brands like the Digi Quartz Stop. Mido, you'll likely know for examples such as their colourful Ocean Star decompression timer from the 60s, but they also ventured into the digital game too with the swissonic LED and different LCD models using Ebauché SA calibers. Enicar is becoming a real obsession of mine, as I love their vintage mechanicals like this Sherpa guide, and I'm planning to make a video on this brand, so my enjoyment of the brand is reinforced by the fact that they also have some pretty cool looking digitals. Rado, the kings of ceramic, have had a go too, including the more recent Diastar, which I keep reading as disaster, which is not appropriate. And Girard Perregaux were innovators in the LED space with this cool looking cassette style LED of the calibre 390 series, with similar offerings from JLC like this Polara Dress LED, targeted primarily, as I understand, at the US market. Tissot was in the game too, with the Tissot 2 timer amongst others. And lastly, one of my favourites, despite how minimal the LED element is the Zenith quartz time command with the Armatron LED. I want one of these, but sadly looking close to £1,000 or so on eBay, so I can only look. And that's it for today's video. Hopefully I've opened your eyes to the varied and mysterious back catalogues of what we see today as primarily analog Swiss luxury watch companies. I hope you agree that there's some cool things in there. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe and take a look at some of my other deep dive content on digital and indeed analog watches. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.